We don't know whether it's because we haven't had a chance to look, or that effects on health don't exist below that level. So that is still an unknown. But it does give us an important benchmark to be looking at new standards. What is the lowest level at which we consistently see effects being reported? And then with a safety margin below that, are we then onto a good track for looking at new threshold levels, action levels, biologically based safety limits? The effects on children are, for almost all environmental toxins, greater than for adults. And in this case, we don't know the answer. We can't test children or on children. But it could really have some serious implications for children by the time they reach their adult years for thinking, judgment, memory, behavior, learning, and so on. And these are very, very serious issues for the next generations of children who do not have a vote and who do not have a choice, but trust adults to make good choices about things like wireless in schools and smart grid. There are effects of extremely low frequency fields that are fairly well defined on Alzheimer's disease. And not too much yet for radio frequency, but mostly it's the lack of study, lack of funding, and lack of study. There is certainly little doubt now that exposure to ELF can cause childhood leukemia. Sam Millam, I hope, is going to talk to us more about that, but it's really not an argument anymore. It's just about how much. And children who recover in high field environments have worse outcomes, which it would be predictable, wouldn't it? I mean, if a child has reacted to a toxin, a toxic exposure of some kind to initiate or promote a cancer, and that child goes back into that environment for recovery at very low environmental fields, look at the numbers, their outcome is about quadruple for an adverse outcome. We have several studies now on that. Studies of breast cancer for women in the workplace show that at 10 milligauss and above, there's rather strong evidence for an association to breast cancer. Also, there are a number, I think there are 9 studies that implicate ELF, EMF to male breast cancer. And because the incidence is so great, this is a very large issue for public health. The consequence of having even a little bit of breast cancer related to EMF is a huge public health problem. One of the ways that we tried very hard in the BioInitiative to convey to people that this really is an exposure that affects people is to say, well, look, at the flip side, we use these fields and these exposures at levels much lower than the existing public safety standards for health reasons. And the FDA approves devices and treatments at ELF and RF exposure levels far below the public safety limits where no biological effects of consequence should even be occurring. So if you then consider that in your daily life we have many and indiscriminate exposures to these things, it's like taking medicines indiscriminately. It's like having multiple and overlapping and randomly occurring exposures to things which can either harm or cure. But when they cure, they're done in very specific ways. So it was sort of, well, if you don't believe the non-thermal effects are occurring and can cause disease, how the heck could they be used for health treatments? And I don't know if it bought us any more credibility, but I think it's a good argument. Finally, again, I'd like for you to try to remember and think about this as biological information conveyed by the signals that cause for biological change, and with chronic exposure, some of those biological changes may lead to loss of well-being, disease, and death. It's not the heating. Conclusions. The evidence indicates that everyday levels are associated with increased risk of both cancer and neurological diseases. And in the short term, of course, effects on sleep, cognition, behavior, attention, concentration, and those things that keep us functioning as a society every day, making good decisions. It occurs in both adults and probably more so in children. And the consequence of believing that is that new public safety limits are warranted. They are warranted now, and they should be based on biologically relevant exposure levels. In the BioInitiative, which is now, 2 years old, 2 and a little, the levels at which we chose to say, we think these are levels that would be reasonable today as action levels, guidelines, thresholds, left it a little loose there, but the numbers that we would get from the science would indicate we need an exposure standard of 1 milligauss or lower where children spend time, and at least nothing more than 2 milligauss for adults, where they spend time in occupied space. And for radio frequency, it was a harder thing to do with, much more complex. But what we could say is that we would recommend a cautionary target level of 0.1 microwatts per centimeter squared for chronic exposure outdoors. And that would give some greater protection indoors. There should be some attenuation, so indoor environments should be better. And today I think that these numbers would be lower. David Carpenter and I made a point to say that these are not final numbers. They represent interim numbers, best judgment, and they probably will go lower. So let me tell you a little bit about what happened next. Now, you can imagine that a group of scientists who have spent their lives developing this kind of science, and they're feeling it's ignored even within their own professional societies. And in fact, it's probably getting in the way of getting grants and promotions and so on, because it's not sexy science, and this science threatens a lot of very large industrial interests around the world. We're taking a risk, and some of the younger people that we considered to come and join us on the BioInitiative, we actually had second thoughts about, because we didn't want to see people's careers impaired by participating in this. Can you imagine going into doing a piece of work and being afraid that it would have negative consequences on your life? Well, all of these people who joined us did, and took that risk. And within 2 weeks of the publication of the BioInitiative in 2007, the European Environmental Agency had taken this issue and said, this is an issue where precaution is necessary. In Europe, we view these things very differently than in the States. And the European Environmental Agency, which is similar to our US EPA, had taken and put on their website an advisory about cell phone use, right from the BioInitiative, and drew attention to it and asked participating government health agencies and ministers to please look hard and look again at the evidence. And they continue today at the EEA to sponsor the message and to encourage people, including many in the European Parliament, to take action to reduce exposures and to warn people and to prevent the rollout of new and unnecessary wireless. So we had a very good immediate reception in Europe. We have had very little reception or response in the United States. We have had much of the groundwork done by the EMR Policy Institute in reaching into congressional staff and congressional offices in the United States to say, hey, look, wake up. While you're spending billions of dollars of stimulus money on smart grid and wireless and the rollout of these things, there's not a penny here for research or communication or education on wireless, and there should be. So we really applaud the work of the EMR Policy Institute as, I think, the leader in trying to bring this message to our government and make for change. And one thing I'd specifically like for you to think about today, any of you in this audience who have talents that would contribute to a working group on smart grid, please put that down on the sheet you'll be given later. I think out of this conference, at a minimum, we need a working group who can evaluate the evidence and use that as one of our first projectiles to talk about change at the federal level. Thank you.